Personality Traits, Part 2, Allport's Trait Assertion. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. In 1931, Gordon Allport published a seminal paper titled What is a Trait of Personality? And in those 4 pages, he lays out kind of the do's and don'ts of what to look at when thinking about personality traits. It was a powerful paper when it was written. I assign it to my students to this day because even though it's about 90 years old, it has a great deal of wisdom behind it. So, let's take a look at these 8 assertions, and I'll give you my views on every one of them, like always, consistently and stably. Trait Assertion 1. A trait has more than a nominal existence. Now, nominal is an important idea. It's important in philosophy and in science. You may remember the nominal level of measurement in your research methods class. Nominalism talks about the fact that something is merely named. The name itself has no value, has no underlying meaning. It's only when we, in science, operationalize it as a construct does it take on any meaning. So a trait is not simply a label for some behavior. It represents regularities in human behavior across time and situations. So if I'm talking about the trait of extroversion, I'm talking about someone who behaves in a certain way if they're high on it, if they score high on that trait. If they score low on that trait, they might behave in a very different way. So the label has to do with labeling the underlying behaviors. The regular behaviors don't change. Our labels sometimes change for them. But traits are more than labels. Now, if we were together in a classroom, I would operationalize it this way. I'd walk to the middle of the classroom and I'd say, okay, everybody to my right is now a bleem. Everyone to my left is non-bleemy. And then I have them try to figure out just what the heck bleem is. Bleem is a totally nonsense word that I use. I may have heard it someplace. I don't think I coined it. But when I talk about bleaminess, it's a nothing burger. It is a label for something. Words can occasionally come to represent sets of behavior that are new words, and we have to always be on the lookout for those types of things. For example, we have jargon words in our culture, like nerd, like geek, stuff like that. And those words have meaning for people. They define someone's interest in technology and lack of social skills, things like that, Big Bang Theory kind of things. And they've come to represent sets of behavior. You might try to put someone down by calling them a geek or tease them and call them a geek. But you're just applying a label to behaviors they may not have. Now, if you were to label me a geek, you probably wouldn't be too wrong. I'm sitting here with a webcam, a video cam. There are 3 different screens here. I've got all this tech stuff because I like playing with my tech toys, which is one of the things about a geek. So traits have meanings. The trait terms have meanings. They operationalize something. They're not just a label that's meaningless. Allport's second assertion. This one's a little historical. Paper was published, remember, in 1931. Psychology was still heavily under the influence of the first great American psychologist, William James. James was interested in habits, how we formed habits, how we got rid of habits, things like that. He was the first of the great functionalist psychologists in this country. So, Allport here is saying that traits are larger units and have more meaning than just simple habits. So traits are not a big habit. You may have the habit of having a cup of coffee every morning or reading the newspaper when you get home from work or school. That's a habit. It's not a trait. Traits are bigger units of analysis. And Allport wanted to differentiate between the notion of habit and trait with this one. The third assertion, traits are dynamic or at least determinative of behavior. What does that mean? It has, first of all, nothing to do with psychoanalysis and psychodynamics. He's using the word dynamic in the generic sense of it. Dynamic is something you're always doing. You're always doing something, taking something in hand. The trait causes behavior. And what Allport is saying here is that traits determine our behavior. Being a classic introvert, when I am offered various and sundry things to do in terms of choices, maybe for social events, I'm going to hover to the small dinner party with a few people rather than the Major Bash with 500 people. That's my trait determining what I would like to do. So these inner characteristics that we have determine our behavior. They cause us to do certain things. And I can't tell you how many times I've done something because I have a certain trait, even if I didn't want to do that behavior. It's just how you might react to something. And in the next couple of units, you'll see that some of these traits are very biological, and you just can't help from reacting into certain ways. But traits are dynamic, and they determine what you do, where you go. My statement that students always get a minor kick out of, or at least they humor me and laugh at the bad joke, is I like to say that the introverts like to hang out inside of the library and the extroverts like to hang off of the library. And that's determined by the trait level. Our fourth assertion, the existence of a trait may be established empirically or statistically. That's an easy one. Do I really even need to explain it? We're talking about the science of personality. And if we can't empirically and statistically test our traits, then they have no scientific value at all. And to be honest, there are some traits that don't have a whole lot of scientific value. Number 5 kind of gets a little technical beyond the scope of our class, but let me explain it anyway. Traits are only relatively, and this slide is worded wrong, I'll correct it when I post it, independent of other traits. Now, this is more of a statistical assertion, and as you'll see with some of our trait models, the traits have been artificially constrained so they're not correlated with each other. Now, sometimes we have to make some compromises in science, and we do that. Other times we just want to see how nature really is, and nature really is all correlated and tangled up with itself. And Allport says this assertion here about independence, that traits are only relatively independent of each other. So they're truly not totally independent. And we also have to remember when we perform a behavior, it's a manifestation of the constellation of all of our traits operating simultaneously. We don't do a trait from one category and then a trait from another category. You don't do a kind of behavior, then an altruistic behavior, then an assertive behavior. You kind of do one behavior that encompasses all of those things at the same time. And our behaviors are manifestations of our total personality. And we have to always remember that one as we start parsing things off into chunks. Assertion 6. A trait, psychologically considered, is not the same as moral or social judgment. Are you good because you're an extrovert and bad because you're an introvert? Heck no. Being an introvert, I wouldn't like that one very much. But if we poll people, we get results like, if you want your kid to be one of two things, do you want your child to be extroverted or introverted? Parents generally say extroverted. Let's face it, we live in a very extroverted society. And it's easier in life to get by as an extrovert than an introvert. I could tell you lots of stories about that one. But we're not making judgments about someone being good or bad. Let me give you another example of this. The trait conscientiousness, which we'll talk about with the fifth five-factor model of personality. You can say, well, you can never be too conscientious. Yes, you can. Extremely high conscientious scores tend to develop perfectionistic tendencies, and nothing is ever good enough, and they never get anything done. So even a trait that is a positive trait, and you're talking about the high side of it, you can have some bad implications for behavior at the extremes. Now this one, a little bit of change over the last about 90 years here. In the last several years, Del Paulis at the University of British Columbia and other people have started studying something they call the dark triad. And we'll talk about the dark triad briefly when we do the five-factor model of personality. But the dark triad is a blend of three of the negative ends of the big five traits. And they tend to yield someone who is kind of evil. It's not a trait of evilness, but it's the easiest way to say it. And it's really hard to say that someone high on the evil trait that does a lot of evil things isn't evil. So we have to look at this assertion with a grain of salt now. Now, assertion 7, I've split into two just to make it a little bit easier to talk about. The first part of this is to talk about traits as being viewed in the light of the personality which contains it. This is case study method stuff. We do idiographic work. It's a word that's rooted in the Greek idios for individual. We might intensely study one or a few people to find out something significant about human personality. So Freud's case studies are a great example of that. But Gordon Allport also wrote a seminal book that was an idiographic analysis of a woman named Jenny Grove Masterson. Jenny was Allport's college roommate's mom. She was a single mother in the this is shortly around the World War I period of time. So Allport goes off to Harvard to college. He has a roommate. This roommate's mom starts writing him letters, trying to get him to help Jenny in terms of controlling her son's behavior. Jenny's son liked to drink, liked to party, liked to gamble, and that had got him in trouble many different times. And since Jenny couldn't live in the dorm, I'm sure she would have loved to have done that, she attempted to do the next best thing and enlist Gordon Allport to help her in keeping her son on the straight and narrow. Well, unfortunately, their efforts didn't work, and Jenny's son was found dead in an alley in Cambridge. The reasons are still mysterious. But Jenny kept on corresponding with Gordon Allport and later with his wife as well for the rest of her life. And after she passed, Allport had thousands of letters, he kept all of them, from Jenny. And he went through and coded them for themes about Jenny's life, to learn about Jenny's personality, and to see if any of that knowledge could transfer to general personality stuff. And Jenny was, I don't know, I've looked at the book, I can't figure out Jenny's personality in modern terms, but she'd be one of these kind of people that drive you crazy. She wrote the Allports when they were young marrieds without a lot of money before Christmas. And in her letter she said, I know you guys are just starting out, money's scarce. Don't bother sending me a Christmas present this year. February rolls around, letter comes from Jenny. I was so disappointed not to get a Christmas present from you this year. What is wrong? So Jenny probably drove lots of people nuts. And studying intensely her letters gives us some insight into broader personality issues. Now, the opposite of idiographic research is nomenthetic research. And nomenthetic research can be defined by how a trait can be viewed in the light of its distribution in the population at large. So, let's do group research. I go to the subject pool. I have 500 students fill out personality questionnaires. That's nomenthetic research. I'm looking at how characteristics are distributed in the population. In fact, I might even go further. I might let's say I'm going to collaborate with my colleague Dr. Yaki in the psych department who studies perfectionism. And we're going to give a perfectionism inventory to 500 students. Then we're going to pluck out the 50 highest scores and the 50 lowest scores. And no, we're not going to set them up in a battle royale, but we're going to put them in an experimental condition and see if there are differences in behavior between extremely perfectionistic and extremely non-perfectionistic people. I've saved the most difficult, I think, assertion for last. And it's not that it's terribly hard, it's just worded in an awkward way. And as you read the article, please don't try to match the assertions up with the order that I presented them here. They're all here, but I've kind of taken some liberties with that. So, the last assertion. Acts or behaviors that are inconsistent with a trait are not proof of the non-existence of the trait. That's a mouthful. I've tried to reword it. Let me show you my rewording, and then I'll explain what both of them mean. And my version is inconsistency in the expression of a trait does not imply the non-existence of a trait, which I don't think is a whole lot better, but you don't know how long I played with that trying to come up with something better. A little caveat there. Some traits are only expressed in some situations. Let me start off by giving you an example of that. And that necessarily shows inconsistency, but I would hazard a guess that none of you watching this video right now are currently engaged in an altruistic behavior. Shame on you. You should be writing checks to the Botwin Research Fund at Box. I just keyed them. You're not altruistic now because there's no motivating environment to arouse your altruism. And many of you may be fine, very altruistic folks, but there's just no reason for it right now. Same with traits like courageousness. There's no reason while you're watching this video to exude a lot of courage. Now, some of you may argue with me on that one. But back to the 8th assertion here. And this is a really, really important one, because people have used the evidence that kind of fits with this assertion to try to imply that personality traits are bad constructs, and then furthermore to imply that there's really no such construct as personality at all. Shame on those people. But anyway, we're not robots. And we behave as creatures relatively consistently. We're not perfect. We don't do the same thing the same way every single time. Occasionally we might do something different because something different is going on in the environment. There are different prompts in the environment to do something. Something might just catch our fancy in another way. Let me give you a case in point example. One of my friends in the department and I regularly go to lunch at a small Chinese restaurant in Fresno. They serve the most marvelous kung pao chicken. It's just done really correctly and really nicely. And the dish is light, and I won't go on anymore, especially if you haven't eaten yet today. But 9 out of 10 times I go into this restaurant, I will order kung pao chicken. In fact, sometimes they'll even bring it to me without me having to order. Once in a while, I'll look at something on the menu and I'll say, I want to have that today. I'm going to have the Mongolian beef, which they also do very well. instead of the Kung Pao. Well, it usually attracts some attention because I'm so boringly consistent. But just because I've had Mongolian beef one time doesn't mean I won't never. I'm trying not to use double negatives here, and I'm having a hell of a time not. But I will eventually order Kung Pao chicken again. It's not that I don't like it, it's just that I wanted something different. You might see a more behavioral example with someone who's generally a nice, happy person, and you say hi to them and they bite your head off. I remember that happening to me one time when I was in school, and one of my favorite teachers had a revolt in the class before mine. He was just ready to explode at anything, and I walked up to him and made an innocuous comment, and he almost bit my head off. Now, he did apologize later because he knew he hadn't done right, but I knew he was a nice guy. He just had a bad situation. So we're not robots, as I've said, probably robotically too many times. And we occasionally act out of character. Just because we occasionally don't act the way that we are due to our traits, it doesn't mean we no longer have that trait. That trait doesn't exist in the population. It's still there. It just didn't function at one time. And I'm sure you could give me many, many examples of people who you know very well, and you've kind of predicted what they're going to do on any occasion. Something happens, and they don't behave that way. That's an important thing to remember, that we're only relatively consistent critters. My time on these assertions is done. I probably talked about it far longer than it took you to read the article. So I'm going to sign off for now. We'll see you on our next installment of personality psychology. And in the next few units, we're going to be getting into what I think is really cool stuff, the personality trait models. We'll see you then. Bye now. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020. Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.